Hi, John. How are you today?
I'm good, Elliot. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
So the second half of 25, obviously a lot of activity. We certainly covered it in our weekly conversations, but also in our podcasts and webinars globally as well as domestically. I think it's important to start off with in July, Treasury delayed. Again, no surprise to some of us that watch this for a living. The investment advisor rule from 2026 to 2028, and then reopened the comment process. Right away, as you would imagine, groups like Transparency International and other anti corruption groups criticized the move as weakening U.S. credibility, especially again during the FATF mutual evaluation process. But investment advisors have been on the table since the Patriot Act in 2001. It's been amazing to see, and obviously, I would argue heavy lobbying probably enabled this to get postponed. So, something to watch, I would guess, in the future, but definitely pushed way down the line.
Also, during the summer, a mid-year report on crypto crime was issued by Chainalysis, and they reported, and this was for the first half of 2025, that over $2 billion was stolen, had already been stolen at that point, and they identified a couple of major events, including North Korea's Bybit hack, which was resulted in the loss of $1.5 billion. So a major issue. And the Genius Act was adopted by the U.S. Congress and signed by the president, which, among other things, created certain capabilities for issuers of stable coins, which is still here at the very end of 2025 being discussed about how people are going to implement that and what that really means both for the economy, but equally importantly for financial crime prevention.
Yeah, so approved issuers under the statute can be subsidiaries of insured depository institutions, non-bank companies, or uninsured national banks approved by regulatory authorities, approved federal branches, or state-approved entities that are not banks or their subsidiaries. And as you say, they're still working on this. I know that the traditional banking industry, through my former association, the ABA, and others, are very concerned that this is going to crowd out traditional banks from deposits based on this. We shall see. But as of our recording this, it's still, as you said, being debated.
Another thing that you and I talked about over the summer was the fact that there were significant staffing cuts to the U.S. State Department, and there were concerns about that as it related to things you and I discussed, which anti-trafficking and counterterrorism, which are functions that State Department is actively involved in. And in fact, this year, the Trafficking in Persons report, which is a comprehensive annual report issued by the State Department, was issued several months later than normal, in part because the office that issues that, the staff reductions were significant, and they're operating on, I think it's fair to say, a skeleton crew.
The counterterrorism office was actually closed, and I was able to interview somebody who used to work in that office, had left a couple of years ago, and he confirmed that many of his former colleagues are basically out on the street looking to use their expertise in other places. So that's a sad commentary on closing that office. The Basel Institute, they do a lot of really good work. This year, they released their 2024 findings on corruption and organized crime. That's obviously always important to take a look at that. And then we talked about sanctions outside the U.S., like, for example, in the United Kingdom, we did some conversations about what they perceive to be gaps in crypto asset sanctions enforcement. So that's important to look at. And then we also talked about something that we've worked a lot on in terms of podcasts and other closely watched areas, and that's the humanitarian toll that sanctions has when they are focused on governments, but in reality affect the population. We talked a bit about corruption risks in Ukraine's reconstruction. That's still something we're dealing with today. Again, the debanking executive order There are also the rise of sextortion scams linked to Southeast Asia, a lot of things going on. And then a lot of policy debate continuing regarding the challenges to the Corporate Transparency Act, as we referenced in our first part of these two conversations.
Yes. And another thing that happened over the summer was the EU did a risk assessment and highlighted the fintech vulnerabilities in the money laundering space. And as we know, some fintech companies have led with solutions and followed with compliance. Many of our friends and colleagues have been employed by fintechs as they've built out their compliance programs, because that's where you can find the experience, people who grew up on the traditional financial services side. But the EU noted that this was something that fintechs operating across Western Europe needed to continue to improve their compliance capability.
And FinCEN, among other things, issued several advisories, but one particularly focused on Chinese money laundering, and then some financial trend analysis combined with that. That's obviously a priority that continues, the Chinese laundering networks. Also, DOJ has been focusing on fraudulent IDs. So there's some cases regarding that. Overseas, a sharp rise in fraud, according to the United Kingdom. And there's what they're calling a landmark new United Kingdom law to address fraud. So we'll see how that works. FinTrack's been active in Canada, so they've done a number of things that we talk about on a regular basis, reports, updates to their PEP policies, those sorts of things. So FinTrack's been particularly active. And then staying outside the U.S., the European Union issued what they call their 19th sanctions package against Russia in the fall. And so they're showing a strong commitment to deter Russia as they continue with the war with Ukraine.
And in recognition of the importance of national risk assessments, FATF released a new national risk assessment toolkit to assist countries who are beginning to do national level risk assessments with a framework and a how-to.
And again, GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has done a number of relevant and important studies on whole aspects of fraud and money laundering and other issues. And they did a reporting in the fall about the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions. So again, a continuing debated point. Prior to this recording, I sat in on a conversation with people in the humanitarian world, and they say that there are studies that show, and this is really amazing to me, that close to over 550,000 people die each year, some reaction to sanctions globally, which is phenomenal. So the notion of the effectiveness of sanctions is important, not just for those obvious reasons there, but for the financial sector and others that have to comply with the sanctions laws and regulations. So I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation in 2026, I think I can predict.
Yeah, there was also continued debate over extending AML obligation. This is in the U.S. to law practices. That is already standard in the UK and the EU, that law firms and therefore their employees are under AML obligations. The U.S., that continues to be a discussion rather than a requirement.
And it certainly seems like the Europeans are more concerned in terms of the law enforcement aspects of cryptocurrency than we seem to be from a policy perspective. And AMLA, the law or the new organization in the EU, we reported on a growing role they have in European Union-wide crypto supervision. So that was also something that we will continue to watch in 2026.
And we'll watch AMLA, the organization, continue to develop as they build out the staff and work with the member state FIUs to move to better coordination, which is one of the purposes of the organization, and as they implement the law, which happens to have the same acronym.
You know, similar to talking about FinTrack and how active they've been In Australia, AUSTRAC, actually the very first financial intelligence unit created in the world, issued a number of warnings and policy reports and others throughout 2025. And it's often pretty important to see what Australia is doing in that part of the world. So AUSTRAC is a really good source for those related AML CFT issues.
And throughout the year, AUSTRAC has been very focused on potential money laundering risks at casinos. They have a very robust gaming industry in Australia, and AUSTRAC has issued a number of penalties and other things as they have found participants in that market to be wanting in terms of their compliance.
Obviously, toward the end of any year, there's always reports. Some are reports of what's occurred in that particular calendar year, others things that have occurred in prior years. So we saw in the fall the releasing of a number of global financial crime trends. We saw the Global Organized Crime Index that was issued. FATF, of course, as we've talked about, they had a number of reports throughout the year, and there was an October plenary. So that was important in terms of enforcement actions, fines and penalties in the U.S. and other places. That's also a good place to look to sort of map out where do you stand in your institution, your clients, in terms of the issues, in particular enforcement actions, not just U.S. enforcement actions, but global ones, which I think actually, Elliot, there's probably been more record fines outside the U.S. than in the U.S. without looking closely. That would certainly be my thought on the 2025.
Yes, and as we discussed just a little earlier and have discussed throughout the year with the Genius Act and other things related to crypto and stable coins in the U.S., late this year, the Bank of England has issued proposed restrictions on the use of stable coins in terms of ownership and other purposes. So again, interesting divergence between other parts of the global economy and the current direction in the U.S. The other thing, and this is the first time we're mentioning it, FATF issued a report on combating online child exploitation, and we have seen other organizations, both law enforcement, I know FinTech in Canada issued a bulletin about that, and other organizations, including those in the U.S. Online child exploitation in a variety of forms is catching everyone's attention, and appropriately. And the goal is to inform folks in the compliance community about red flags and those kinds of things to try to stem that terrible activity.
We mentioned the OCC, the comptroller testified late 2025. And I would urge everybody, this is on the House side, to take a look at that testimony because it gives you a very clear indication of where we think the OCC is going to be going forward. And I'll just reference a couple of items from the written testimony. One is the following, I'm quoting here. The OCC's support functions have degraded over the last 4 years, posing a risk to our ability to execute our statutory mission. Outward signs of this decline include the hiring of a fraudulent, quote, chief financial technology officer, unquote, in 2022, and an email data breach that took nearly 2 years to identify, affecting our credibility. Not sure what the fraudulent referencing there, the missing of the email data breach, I suppose. Supervision, according to the comptroller, must be clear, credible, and consequential. We are cutting away procedural clutter and returning to risk-based supervision rooted in law with an emphasis on examiner judgment, not arbitrary checklists. So if you're interested in where we think we're going to be in 2026, I think taking a look at this testimony will get you started.
John, before we finish up, I just want to remind people that we'll be doing our January webinar on human trafficking, and that'll stream on January 22nd. You can register currently at our website, amlrightsource.com, for that session, and I urge you to register and watch that panel. As always, we'll have great experts to provide excellent insights.
as we sign off here, Happy New Year to everybody. And as somebody once said years ago, as we think about the challenges of 2026, keep the faith, everybody. We want to make sure AML stays with a strong infrastructure and that we continue to do every day what we know makes a difference to society and communities. So hang in there, everybody.
Agreed. John, you have a great rest of the week, and I will talk to you next week.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.